Welcome to Spooky Ass Shit. I am your host, Eric Dwinnells, and I am all alone once again. And again, it's completely my fault. It's a little bit of an unusual circumstance this time. Actually, the reason I'm alone this week is because I actually recorded a whole episode with one of your favorites and mine, Tom Cole, as a guest host. But I wasn't happy with the way the show turned out, through no fault of Tom's. I just feel like the show was going to be about manipulation and cults and like that kind of stuff, how brainwashing can lead you into cult life. And I just felt like I didn't present it the way that I wanted to. Again, having nothing to do with Tom himself, but I just felt like, you know what, let's try that again sometime and really do a really solid episode about it, because it's a really interesting topic, and I think that we could just do a better job with it. And Tom agreed very kindly, and I was glad that. I was afraid, I was gonna hurt his feelings or something, but even he agrees. Quality control is a good thing, and you may be surprised to hear that the show has a level of quality control, but we do. We really do. In fact, this is not the first episode that I've held back from you guys. There's another episode that I recorded with guest co-host Tristan Sapersky. You may remember her from the Grim Reaper episode. We did a whole episode about the Halloween special edition of the 1980s sitcom Kate and Allie. And and she had never even heard of the show Kate and Allie, let alone their Halloween episode. But I thought, well, that's good, because she's never seen it. We'll watch it together and then we'll talk about it. And hopefully she'll have a fresh perspective with things to say. And that did not turn out to be the case. Again, through no fault of Tristan's. But it just, I think the problem with that episode was it was a little too niche. Or niche. I think I used to say it niche, and then I had a teacher that said, she used to say Nietzsche. You've got to find your Nietzsche. And we were like, the whole class was like, that's not how you say that word. Anyway, however you do say it. Niche, I would say. I realized after the fact, I'm like, maybe not enough people are going to remember this particular episode of Kate and Allie, or even Kate and Allie in general, to make this worthwhile. It is from the Halloween tape that I've talked about in episodes past, from the 1986 Halloween tape that my mother made for me. I will probably post that episode somehow, some way, whether it be on YouTube, or maybe I'll edit it down so it's not a full episode, and it will be like a mini episode sometime when we have a little bit extra space. But if you're interested in hearing the lost Kate and Allie episode of Spooky AS, let me know. If no one's interested, I'll probably just keep it to myself. And as for the one that I did with Tom, don't worry about that. It will be coming up. We're going to redo it to bring you a better version of that same episode. But tonight, we are going to talk about America's favorite cryptid, Bigfoot. The problem with Bigfoot, when you see him on TV and all those kind of, like the Bigfoot hunter shows and all that stuff, I really don't give a shit about a bunch of people going out in the woods with their infrared cameras and their night vision and putting them on trees and capturing pictures of forest animals walking around, and we didn't find any definitive evidence, but what was that howl? Did you hear that howl? Did you hear those knockings? I don't give a shit about any of that bullshit. That is not interesting television to me. It must be to someone out there, because those shows keep popping up. So I don't know if you guys are watching them or what, but please stop if that's what you're doing. I want to hear about Bigfoot encounters and Bigfoot attacks. Those are the stories that I can get interested in, and that is what we are going to talk about tonight on Spooky AS. If you listened to last week's episode of the show, you might notice that our guest co-host, Aaron Cohen, when we were talking about the ghost of Disney World, and I mentioned, well, I wondered, really, if a ghost could masturbate. And Aaron seemed a little taken aback by that comment on the show, and he just kind of wanted to move on. And then later on, we got into some other things where he just kind of wanted to move on, and it might seem like he was uncomfortable. I just want to state that after the show, after we'd finished recording, Aaron actually said to me that he enjoyed coming on this show because we talk like that. And we aren't we don't have these constraints, because most of the time he's talking about Disney and he goes somewhere and it's like a Disney podcast or something, so they're kind of trying to play nice. Well, we don't really do that here. We go off the top of our head and talk about whatever we want to talk about, of course. Not that I'm not trying to say we're extreme or, something like that, but we're free. That's all. We're free. And that thought just occurred to me. Why is a ghost hanging out in the locker room unless he's trying to get his rocks off? And then it occurred to me, can a ghost get his rocks off? So Aaron was taken aback by it, but he was not offended, and he's not a prude. He's not used to speaking that way about Disney attractions. And honestly, it's probably not great for his brand per se. But on the other hand, he's on my show. So when he gets a show, I'll go on his and I'll play nice and I won't say dirty things. But on my show, we're talking about dirty things. I might as well take this time before we really dive into things here to remind you to visit the website, spookyas.com or spookyasshit.com. They both take you to the same place, which is the show's blog page. From there, you can see pictures from this episode and every episode of Spooky AS. You can also listen to every episode. You can find our social media links, or you can just go to them when I tell you them now. We are at Spooky Ass Shit on Instagram and Twitter. And you can like us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. Pretty please, with extra sugar on top, share the show with your friends. In fact, I got an email last week from a man named Alfred. Hey, Alfred, how's it going? Who told me that a friend of his turned him on to the show, and now he's been listening for 2 weeks, and he looks forward to the show. So Alfred's friend, he didn't tell me your name, but I also want to thank you for turning Alfred onto the show, and I hope that the rest of you will continue to do that. Share the show, subscribe to the show, rate the show, and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher or iHeartRadio or wherever you happen to be listening from. It really helps us out, and the more shares and likes and all that kind of stuff, the more numbers we have, the bigger we grow, the more opportunities we'll have to build something that we can all be excited about. What that may be, I don't know. I can't say. We got to wait and see what kind of audience we get, what we can build. Hopefully live shows, hopefully some merchandise that you guys can proudly wear and all that kind of stuff. So we'll see. Good things will come if we just keep at it. And that's what we're doing. I don't do a lot of fancy advertising. I just tell people to listen. You tell people to listen, and we grow this thing organically. This is an organic podcast. On to our subject at hand. Now, of course, I've known about Bigfoot. I don't know what the plural is. But anyway, I've known about them for as long as I can remember. And of course, you spookaroos that have been listening a while know that I was super into Unsolved Mysteries as a kid, so I'm sure Bigfoot came up on that show and shows like it. But the first real clear memory I have about Bigfoot was when I was in Cub Scouts, or maybe Weeblos. I definitely wasn't old enough to be a Boy Scout yet, so I was either a Cub Scout or a Weeblo. But anyway, when you join those organizations, scouting, you get a subscription to Boys Life magazine. And there was an article in one of these Boys Life magazines about a man who claimed that he was kidnapped by Bigfoot. And to this day, I remember the illustration that went with the article of this man in a sleeping bag being hoisted over the shoulder of a Bigfoot looking terrified. And that has stuck with me. And when I was doing some research for today's episode, I found the story that article was based on. I couldn't find that exact article, but according to Wikipedia, it is the July edition of the 1991 series of Boys Life magazine. So if anyone out there has a copy, feel free to scan it my way. I would love to see it. I especially want to see that illustration again. I remember in my head how it looks, but I can't swear that that's exactly what it was like. But I have a certain image in my head. So I wonder how close I am, because I probably haven't seen it since 1991. But we're going to talk about that exact story, and we're going to talk about a couple more. I actually had a whole list of Bigfoot attacks and kidnappings, and I think I made a list of too many of them. So this might be a volume 1 with a volume 2 to come on later down the road. So let's get started. I went in historical order of the ones that I found. And actually, our first encounter is told to us by President Teddy Roosevelt. Now, he actually he wrote a book in 1890 called The Wilderness Hunter. And in it, he shares a story about a man that he met along... Teddy Roosevelt was a rough rider, and he was like an outdoorsman and a hunter and like a real macho kind of guy, right? And he tells a story about this old man that he met while he was out hunting buffalo, I believe. And this old man has a story to tell. Now, they don't say that it was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or anything like that in the story. The term Bigfoot hadn't come around yet. Anyway, so that wouldn't have popped up. But Sasquatch or anything like that, actually Teddy Roosevelt refers to it as a goblin, but it's pretty clear from its description that this could be a Bigfoot that we're talking about. So instead of, coming up with my own thing to say about it, I'm actually going to read you the famous passage where he wrote this before he was president, but he would be president, Teddy Roosevelt starts talking about this encounter that this man had. Should I do a voice? I don't know a Teddy Roosevelt voice. Frontiersmen are not, as a rule, apt to be very superstitious. They lead lives too hard and practical and have too little imagination in things spiritual and supernatural. I have heard but few ghost stories while living on the frontier, and those few were perfectly commonplace and conventional in type. But I once listened to a goblin story which rather impressed me. A grizzled, weather-beaten old mountain hunter named Bowman, who, born and had passed all of his life on the frontier, told the story to me. He must have believed what he said, for he could hardly repress a shudder at certain points in the tale, but he was of German ancestry, and in childhood had doubtless been saturated with all kinds of ghost and goblin lore, so that many fearsome superstitions were latent in his mind. Besides, he knew well the stories of the Indian medicine men in their winter camps, of the snow walkers, of the specters, which are spirits or ghosts or apparitions, of the formless evil beings that haunt the forest depths, and waylay the lonely wanderer who, after nightfall, passes through their regions, wander where they lurk. It may be that when overcome by the horror of the fate that befell his friend, and when oppressed by the awful dread of the unknown, he grew to attribute, both at the same time and still more in his remembrance, weird and elfin traits to what was merely some abnormally wicked or cunning wild beast. But whether this was so or not, no man can say. When the event first occurred, Bowman was still a young man, and he was trapping with a partner among the mountains dividing the forks of the Salmon River and the head of the Wisdom River. Not having had much luck, he and his partner determined to go into a particularly wild and lonely pass, through which ran a small stream said to contain many beavers. The pass had an evil reputation because the year before a solitary hunter who had wandered into it was slain, seemingly by a wild beast, the half-eaten remains being afterwards found by some mining prospectors who had passed his camp only the night before. The memory of this event, however, weighed very lightly on the two trappers, who were as adventurous and hardy as others of their kind. They took their two lean mountain ponies to the foot of the pass, where they left them by an open beaver meadow, the rocky timber-clad ground being from there onward impractical for horses. They then struck out on foot through the vast and gloomy forest, and in about 4 hours reached a little open glade, where they concluded to camp, as signs of game were aplenty. There was still an hour or two of daylight left, and after building a brush lean-to, throwing down and opening their packs, they started upstream. The country was very dense and hard to travel through, as there was much down timber, although here and there the somber woodland was broken by small glades of mountain grass. At dusk, they again reached camp. The glade in it, which was pitched, was not many yards wide, the tall, close-set pines and firs rising around it like a wall. On one side was a little stream, beyond which rose a steep mountain slope, covered with the unbroken growth of evergreen forest. They were surprised to find that during their absence something, apparently a bear, had visited their camp, and had rummaged among their things, scattering the contents of their packs in sheer wantonness and destroying their lean-to. The footprints of the beast were quite plain, but at first they paid no particular heed to them, busying themselves with rebuilding their lean-to, laying out their beds and their stores, and lighting a fire. While Bowman was making a ready supper, it being already dark, his companion began to examine the tracks more closely, and soon took a brand from the fire to follow them up where the intruder had walked along a game trail after leaving the camp. When the brand flickered out, he returned and took another, repeating his inspection of the footprints very closely. Coming back to the fire, he stood by it a minute or two, peering into the darkness, and suddenly remarked, "Bowman, that bear has been walking on 2 legs." Bowman laughed at this, but his partner insisted that he was right, and upon examination of the tracks with a torch, they certainly did seem to be made by 2 paws or feet. However, it was too dark to be sure. After discussing whether the footprints could possibly be those of a human being, and coming to the conclusion that they could not be, the 2 men rolled up their blankets and went to sleep under the lean-to. At midnight, Bowman was awakened by some noise and sat up in his blankets. As he did so, his nostrils were struck by a strong, wild, beastly odor, and he caught the loom of a great body in the darkness at the mouth of the lean-to. Grasping his rifle, he fired at the vague, threatening shadow, but he must have missed, for immediately afterwards he heard the smashing of the underwoods as the thing, whatever it was, rushed off into the impenetrable blackness of the forest and the night. After this, the 2 men slept but little, sitting up by the rekindled fire, but they heard nothing more. In the morning they started out to look for a few traps that they had set in the previous evening and put out new ones. By an unspoken agreement they kept together all day, and returned to camp towards the evening. On nearing it, they saw, hardly to their astonishment, that the lean-to had again been torn down. The visitor of the preceding day had returned, and in wanton malice had tossed about their camp kit and bedding, and destroyed their shanty. The ground was marked up by its tracks. On leaving the camp, it had gone along the soft earth by the brook. The footprints were as plain as if on snow, and, after careful scrutiny of the trail, it certainly did seem as if, whatever this thing was, it had walked off on but 2 legs. The men, thoroughly uneasy, gathered a great heap of dead logs that kept the fire roaring throughout the night, one or the other sitting guard most of the time. About midnight, the thing came down through the forest opposite, across the brook, and stayed there on the hillside for nearly an hour. They could hear the branches crackle as it moved about, and several times it uttered harsh, grating, long drawn-out moans. A particularly sinister sound. Yet it did not venture near the fire. In the morning, the 2 trappers, after discussing the strange events of the last 36 hours, decided that they would shoulder their packs and leave the valley that afternoon. They were more than ready to do this because, in spite of seeing a good deal of game sign, they had caught very little fur. However, it was necessary to first go along the line of the traps and gather them, and this they started out to do. All the morning they kept together, picking up trap after trap, each one empty. On first leaving camp, they had a disagreeable sensation of being followed. In the dense spruce thicket, they occasionally heard a branch snap after they had passed, and now and then there was a slight rustling noise among the small pines on one side of them. At noon they were back within a couple miles of camp. In the high, bright sunlight, their fears seemed absurd to the 2 armed men, accustomed as they were, through long years of lonely wandering in the wilderness, to face every kind of danger from man, brute, or element. There were still 3 beaver traps to collect from a little pond in a wide ravine nearby. Bowman volunteered to gather these and bring them in, while his companion went ahead to the camp and made ready the packs. On reaching the pond, Bowman found 3 beavers in the traps, one of which had been pulled loose and carried into a beaver house. He took several hours in securing and preparing the beaver, and when he started homewards he marked, with some uneasiness, how low the sun was getting. He hurried toward the camp under the tall trees. The silence and desolation of the forest weighed on him. His feet made no sound on the pine needles, and the slanting sunrays striking through and among the straight trunks made a gray twilight in which objects at a distance glimmered indistinctly. There was nothing to break the gloomy stillness which, when there was no breeze, always broods over these somber primeval forests. At last he came to the edge of a little glade where the camp lay, and he shouted as he approached it, but got no answer. The campfire had gone out, though the thin blue smoke was still curling upwards. Near it lay the packs wrapped and arranged. At first Bowman could see nobody, nor did he receive an answer to his call. Stepping forward, he again shouted, and as he did so, his eyes fell on the body of his friend, stretched out beside the trunk of a great fallen spruce. Rushing towards it, the horrified trapper found that the body was still warm, but that the neck had been broken, while there were 4 great fang marks on the throat. The footprints of the unknown beast creature, printed deep in the soft soil, told the whole story. The unfortunate man, having finished his packing, sat down on the spruce log with his face toward the fire and his back towards the dense woods, to wait for his companion. While thus waiting, his monstrous assailant, which must have been lurking in the woods, waiting for the chance to catch one of the adventurers unprepared, came silently up from behind, walking with long, noiseless steps, and seemingly still on 2 legs. Evidently unheard, it reached the man and broke his neck by wrenching his head back with his forepaw, while it buried his teeth in his throat. It had not eaten the body, but apparently had romped and gamboled around it in an uncouth, ferocious glee, occasionally rolling over and over it, and had then fled back into the soundless depths of the woods. Bowman, utterly unnerved and believing that the creature with which he had to deal was something either half-human or half-devil, some great goblin beast, abandoned everything. He abandoned everything but his rifle and struck off at speed down the pass, not halting until he reached the beaver meadows where the hobbled ponies were still gazing. And that's the end of the story as Teddy Roosevelt tells it. Later in the book, he does go on to say that while on a hunt, he one time heard some strange noises that unnerved him. He could not identify them. He, again, was an outdoorsman, very used to being in the woods, hearing these animals. He hears these noises he can't identify, and they were eerie, and they unnerved him. But he does not go out to investigate, and he also does not speculate as to what the noises could have been, which is very unusual. He's very descriptive about nature and all his travels and adventures. So, a very interesting story from President Teddy Roosevelt. We're going to move forward in history now to 1924. And actually, I've got a pair of stories here that are both set in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is apparently a Bigfoot hotspot. Now, this story is the story of Albert Ostman, and this is the one that I was talking about, they reference in the magazine Boy's Life when I was a kid. So this was one of my first scary Bigfoot stories. I thought it was scary at the time. Now, well, you be the judge. Ostman was a prospector, and he was on vacation at the Toba Peninsula, or Inlet, in British Columbia. But while he was there, he had heard of some hidden treasure, and he was a prospector anyway. So he said, I'm going to take my vacation here, and I'm going to look for this hidden treasure. He hired a Native American guide to show him around the area. The guide said that he too had heard of hidden treasure somewhere in the area. For years before, there was another white man who would come in to town, then go into the wilderness, and come out with gold, which he would use to fund his drinking habit back in the taverns of the town. But, the native warned, one time he went into the wilderness, and he never came out. The natives believed this was because the Sasquatch had taken him. Ostman was unfamiliar with the term Sasquatch, and he asked the native guide what kind of animal it was. The native said it was not an animal. It was a type of giant human who was covered in hair and lived in the mountains. Ostman assumed that this was simply Native American folklore, and he brushed it off. Once they reached the campsite, he dismissed his native guide, asking him to come back in about 3 weeks to retrieve him. Ostman spent several days hunting and prospecting, occasionally moving his camp further into the wilderness. At one point, he found an exceptionally good camping spot and made himself at home there. But, over the course of 3 nights, his campsite had been disturbed. At first, he assumed it was just, the animals of the forest. But on the 3rd night, he states that something had gone through his backpack, which he had hung up high on a tree. The bag was still hanging from the tree, but it was turned upside down, and its contents were on the ground below. There were a few food items missing, but mostly everything was there, and it hadn't really been torn apart or anything. Postman thought this was strange, because he assumed that the only animal that would do this would be a bear, but if a bear had rummaged through the site, he wouldn't have been so neat about it, and he probably would have eaten his fill right there on the spot, not carried it away. Ostman grabbed his rifle and his sleeping bag. He filled his sleeping bag with some foodstuff and some other items to keep his late-night visitors from getting at it. He remained fully dressed, ready for conflict, resolved to stay awake on that fourth night and confront whoever or whatever had been disturbing his camp. He hid himself away on the top of a nearby ledge with a good view of the entire campsite. Unfortunately, despite his best efforts, Ostman fell asleep in the comfort of his sleeping bag. When he awoke, his sleeping bag had been pulled up closed tight, leaving only a very small opening at the top. In his haze, he struggled to work out what was happening. He remembered that he was camping, but now he seemed to be moving. At first, he thought he must be caught in a snowslide, but then he remembered there had been no snow around his campsite. Then he thought maybe he had been thrown on horseback, but he realized he could feel whatever was carrying him underneath him, and it was not a horse's back. He seemed to be slung over the shoulder of some creature. It didn't take long for him to recall the story of the Sasquatch. While I'm reading you the story, by the way, which I typed in my own words, autocorrect changed Ostman to postman every time. Like a mail carrier, postman. So if I seem to pause, it's because I'm stopping to correct myself and not say postman. Anyway, let's continue with our story, shall we? Ostman estimated that the creature carried him through the forest for at least 3 hours before finally setting him down. At first, Ostman was too frightened to open his sleeping bag. He could hear chattering sounds. It sounded like human speech almost, but he couldn't quite make out what the creatures were saying. In the dark of night, he could see 3 vague shapes silhouetted against the dark night sky. He opened his bag just enough so that he could get a good look. There were 4 Sasquatches staring back at him, just as the native guide had described them. It looked like a family, with a father, mother, daughter, and son. The children seemed to be afraid of him. The mother seemed displeased that the father had brought him into their camp. Mother and father appeared to be arguing. Father raised his voice and began waving his arms. Ostman, still holding his rifle, finally got out of his sleeping bag, and he said, "What do you want with me?" But the creatures just continued their chatter. The creatures had not really harmed him, so he decided not to shoot them, but still, he wanted to escape. Unfortunately, he was surrounded on 3 sides by tall rock formations. There was only one way in or out, and the father Sasquatch seemed to be guarding this path. As night turned into day, Ostman ate some of his canned food while the boy Sasquatch watched. When he was done, he tossed the tin to the boy, who was delighted with it. He showed it to his sister, and the two began to play with it for most of the day. The next morning, Ostman realized that he would eventually run out of canned food and should not stay with the Sasquatch family much longer. He resolved to get back to his own camp, even if he had to shoot his way out. He picked up his things and, rifle in hand, walked toward the entrance. The father Sasquatch stopped him, putting his hands up as if to hold him back, and saying something that sounded like, "Zuka, Zuka." Ostman considered shooting him, but he didn't think his .30-30 rifle would be powerful enough to have much of an effect on so large a creature other than making him angry. He returned to the far side of the camp and resolved to find another way out. Ostman remembered a story he heard about a man who stopped a charging bull by throwing snuff in his eyes. Ostman had several cans of snuff with him, but he didn't know how to get close enough to the father Sasquatch to get it into his eyes. He figured his best bet was the curious boy. The next day, while he chewed snuff, he gave the boy the can, which had a small amount of snuff still in it. Ostman motioned to the boy that he should bring the can to his father, which the boy did. The father smelled it, and then he scooped the remaining snuff out of the can and began to chew it, eventually swallowing it. He seemed to have a long talk with the boy, and the boy looked happy. The next day, Ostman opened another can of snuff, and the boy approached him immediately, saying something that sounded like, "Ook!" and gesturing towards his father. Ostman said, "No," and gestured for the boy to lead the father over to him. But the boy did not seem to understand. He went off to play with the can that Ostman had given him the day before. Ostman was positive that the only real danger here was the father Sasquatch. The mother was rather frightened of him, the girl seemed very gentle, and the boy had nearly befriended him. Ostman was sure that if he could convince the father to eat a whole can of snuff, it would kill him, and then he could make his escape. Now, Ostman goes on to describe what the creatures looked like, but his description, it's really kind of just your generic Bigfoot descriptions. Hairy, tall people with sloping foreheads, between 7 and 8 feet tall. But there is a bizarre passage where he describes the mother. First of all, he mentions that she has bangs, and then I'll just read you the quote. Quote, "She had very wide hips and a goose-like walk. She was not built for beauty or speed. Some of those lovable brassieres and uplifts would have been a great improvement on her looks and figure." The fuck? You're talking about a Sasquatch. You can't take dudes anywhere, man. I'm telling you. Ostman spent about a week living with the Sasquatch family before the father finally approached him for more snuff. As soon as Ostman opened a new can, the father grabbed it and emptied its contents into his mouth. He seemed pleased at first, but then his eyes started to roll back in his head. He began to howl, and he ran out of the camp, presumably to find a stream full of water. This was Ostman's chance. He quickly gathered up his belongings and made for the exit. The Sasquatch family began to shout, but only the ugly-ass mother gave chase. He turned and fired his rifle over her head. Hearing the loud bang of the gun, she ran back into the stone encampment. Ostman fired another shot and ran off into the wilderness. After hours of hiking, he finds a logging stand and tells the men working there that he is a prospector who'd lost his way in the forest. He did not tell them about the Sasquatch encounter for fearing that they would call him crazy. In fact, he didn't tell anybody about this encounter until 33 years later. All right, we might go into overtime here, but I've got one more story for you, and it's relatively quick. Again, this is also from British Columbia, and I'm trying to stall because I'm trying to find the beginning of the story, but I failed. This one is also from the 20s, just a couple years after our last story. Our last story was set in 1924. This one is 1928. Again, also Vancouver, British Columbia. Several missionary priests were living with a tribe of Native Americans known as the Nootka. One of the missionary priests, Father Anthony Terhar, became very friendly with the Nootka, and from him we hear the story of one particular native, a man called Muchalat Harry, and his encounter with a family of Bigfoot, big feet, Sasquatch. Harry was a trapper and would often go out on his own to set and check traps for animals that would provide food and fur for his tribe. On this particular trip, he was going to spend several months laying out traps along the Canuma River. From his village, he canoed some 45 miles to the mouth of the river, where he stashed his canoe and walked for about another 12 miles upriver on foot. One night, while sleeping at his camp, wrapped in his blanket and wearing only his underwear, he awoke to find himself being carried off by a Bigfoot. The Bigfoot didn't take him too far, only a few miles at most. Afraid, Harry apparently passed out. He awoke to find himself surrounded by a whole tribe of big feet. They were both male and female, adults and children. The creatures watched him curiously. Harry was afraid already, but he became downright terrified when he saw bones scattered around the area. He became convinced that these big feet intended to eat him. Some of the male big feet came towards Harry to touch him and examine him. They were fascinated by his underwear, which they continually pulled at. Although they caused him no harm that day, Harry was still sure that they were eventually planning to eat him, and he could think of nothing but escape. As the day went on, the Bigfoot seemed to lose interest in Harry. The males left the camp, perhaps to go hunt more food, and the women and children paid little mind to Harry. Now was his chance to escape. While no one was looking, he ran for it and never looked back. Although he was only wearing his underwear, which, by the way, had been torn by the curious Bigfoot, Out of sheer panic, he ran right past his camp without packing up additional clothing or any of his gear. He ran all the way to the canoe that he had stashed earlier and paddled all the way back to his village and tribe, both known as Nootka. Father Anthony was there when Harry returned home. He says it was about 3 a.m. and the whole village was asleep when the peaceful night was disturbed by the wild cries of a man coming from the area of the river. Father Anthony and the men of the tribe went to investigate. They found an exhausted, nearly frozen, nearly naked Harry lying in his canoe. Father Anthony stayed close to Harry's side, but it took 3 whole weeks to nurse Harry back to health. During this time, his hair had turned white as snow. Eventually, he told his tale to Father Anthony, and later on, he began to share his story with all of his tribe. The men of the tribe asked Harry when he intended to go back to his campsite and collect his traps, his rifles, his pots, his pans, and his other gear. Harry said he would never go back there. In fact, he never even went outside of the Nootka village again. So that's it. Those are our Bigfoot Attack and Kidnap Stories, Volume 1. Like I said, I actually do have more, but we're already out of time. So I'm going to remind you once again, please check out the website, spookyas.com. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. You can write to me with your show ideas, questions, or comments at spookyasshit@gmail.com. Don't forget, that's ass, not as. So that's ASS. And I'll remind you once again, please, please, please share, rate, review, and subscribe to the show on whatever platform you happen to be listening to. Even if you're on YouTube, we automatically upload the show to YouTube now. So if you're listening from YouTube, hey, how you doing? Welcome to the show. You're called Spookaroos. Thanks for listening. So thank all you Spookaroos for listening once again. And keep out of the woods. Until next time, don't be afraid.